Even Russia's central bank has been sanctioned. They're not able to convert their foreign reserves into rubles, for instance. What kind of opening does this create for cryptocurrencies?
So first of all, I'm glad you asked the question the way you did, because there have been a lot of people who think that we froze the central bank assets of the Russian central bank. We didn't. The Europeans didn't. The Japanese didn't. What we did was we froze their ability to convert those reserves into rubles for currency stabilization and intervention purposes. But actually, those central bank assets still exist. If the Russians wanted to buy $400 billion worth of widgets, theoretically, they could still do that if those widgets weren't on the sanctions list. So that leads to the crypto side. There are some people out there that are now saying this is the death of the dollar, this is the death of the euro. We have done all these things that make it now untenable for foreign governments to hold their reserves in these, the established core of the reserve currency basket that central banks have been holding for a long time. For the dollar, it's been 75 years. I disagree with that. I don't think crypto is going to benefit from this as a reserve currency asset for a lot of reasons. Number one, which is I'm waiting for the moment in which there is a deep, flawed execution of some crypto strategy that blows up something. It's not going to blow up the crypto sector. I'm not anti-crypto. I'm just saying in this environment to think it's going to be a global reserve currency that's going to supplant the dollar or the euro, I think is far-fetched. And I also think this has made regulators in the US and elsewhere more attuned to the risks of crypto not being a managed reserve currency kind of proxy that can be managed from a regulatory perspective. And they're going to probably have your usual congressional hearings, et cetera, to figure out what to do about it. I'm just not worried about the dollar as a reserve currency as a result of this. And I'm not worried about crypto as a result of this either.
Okay, so you don't see crypto supplanting the US dollar or any of the other major currencies, but you did go to where I wanted to go to next, which is on regulation of cryptocurrencies. We've already seen senators push Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to explain how the Treasury is going to get cryptocurrency companies and middlemen to do their part in enforcing economic sanctions against Russia. What can be done there? I mean, how much do we assume those middlemen and cryptocurrency companies or exchanges are already doing their part in making sure they can transact on behalf of Russians, companies, or people to convert some of their foreign currency into cryptocurrency?
Well, look, what we're going through right now is unprecedented on almost every level. So first of all, we have no precedent for how to regulate cryptocurrencies, nor how to figure out what those exchanges are or are not doing to comply with your basic anti-money laundering provisions, not to mention what is ongoing now, which is this newfangled set of Russian sanctions. So I think it's impossible to answer what the exchanges are going to do, what the regulators are going to do, and what the Russians are going to do. Clearly, if you've cut off the Russian government and the Russian industry and the Russian financial sector from its traditional access to the global financial system, they are going to try and find ways around that. It's not going to simply be the trade through the PBOC. There are going to be other structures they're going to try and create. And, necessity is the mother of all innovation. Let's see what emerges from this and then what the regulatory feedback will be, pushback will be. But I assume that exchanges are, in most cases, trying to do their best. But this is unprecedented stuff. They are not really structured to manage something like this because, let's face it, 8 days ago, nobody expected to see any of this.
Fair enough, fair enough. You mentioned PBOC. Do you see any evidence that the People's Bank of China or China at large is helping Russia skirt some of the sanctions or get around the sanctions?
No, but if you look at, again, what we did on the major sanctions, the central bank sanctions, the PBOC is not taking the same steps. So the reason that is, quote, working is because you had an enormous, cohesive, coherent, unified approach by the Fed. Well, it's by the US, by the ECB, the EU, by the UK, by Japan, et cetera. So the central banks are, in some cases, the mechanism. They're not the policymakers here. But the Chinese government and the PBOC did not agree. So right now, China can continue to exchange its renminbi for rubles. So the thing is, the renminbi is a reserve currency. The ruble is not. So the PBOC doesn't have a lot of rubles sitting there as a reserve. They might have a little bit just to ease trade flows, but it's not something they have a lot of. So the PBOC by not being part of the sanctions package, is not necessarily on board with everybody else, but they're not evading or avoiding anything that the rest of the world has done. What we will see now are whether the banks in China decide to err on the side of caution or opportunistically try and fill a vacuum. My sense is the Chinese banks are doing a very simple calculus, which is to say they know that if they are seen as evading US sanctions, much less EU sanctions, they are at risk of being cut off from dollar and euro markets that are way more important to their markets than is the Russian market. So I would assume they are going to err on the side of caution and not step over the line if they can avoid it.
Right, or jeopardize their trade relations with the U.S. or Europe, especially after some blockbuster deals with Europe. I want to talk about what Ukraine has demanded, which is that the U.S. and Europe sanction Russia's energy sector. And that hasn't happened yet, mainly because Europe still needs Russian gas, right? Are sanctions on Russian energy exports inevitable, you think?
They're not inevitable. I think that the U.S. and Europe have been very cautious, not only because of the economic impact, but because of the political impact. Right now, the world has really come together in a way that was somewhat unforeseen behind stronger approach against Russia's aggression. That does mean that there's more political will potentially to absorb some costs, some sacrifices. But if you're a German business owner or an Italian homeowner, and you are suddenly going to find that you either have to pay 3, 4, 5 times the cost for that natural gas as you did 2 or 3 weeks ago, or you don't have access to it at all, or if you're in the US and suddenly your gasoline prices are going up by whatever that increment could be, then the question is, from a political standpoint, are your politicians saying, well, we want to make sure we have everybody behind us, so let's make sure before we do something like that, that we actually have their collective support. So far, we've seen signs that, yes, U.S. public support and European public support seems to be willing to make more sacrifices than a lot of politicians might have thought they were. But it's one thing to say that you're behind Ukraine and you want to, sanction Russia. It's another thing if it costs you personally, and we haven't seen that. So I think politicians are being very wary of going down that route. Your question was, is it inevitable? I think you're seeing growing momentum in this country, in the United States, for oil import restrictions from Russia. That's different than sanctions. That's limited to the relatively small, it's about 7% import of Russian oil to this country, and it's very low-grade oil that's not used for making the traditional gasoline that you put in your car at the pump. So there's more of a movement to restrict that, either through legislative action or through administrative action. In Europe, similarly, you've seen some moves to say, well, it's about time that we really bite the bullet and wean ourselves off of Russian gas. The U.S., with the help of Qataris and others, have tried to create alternative sources of liquid natural gas. But this is still going to be painful. I still think there's going to be a lot of hesitation before they do it.